You're nothing but a useless, worthless thing. Those words, spat by my own son, struck my chest like a bullet fired at point-blank range. It wasn't the tone, wasn't the rudeness. It was his cold stare, as if I were a burden he carried against his will. I sat there in my wheelchair, looking at that face I once rocked to sleep, the same face that lit up when he unwrapped his first birthday gift. I wondered when he stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me only as dead weight. It wasn't the word disabled that hurt. It was useless. That was more than an insult. It was like he was erasing me from our shared history. My name is Calvin. I'm 74 years old, and until 3 years ago, my life was entirely different. I worked. I drove my truck. I kept up my lawn. I handled my groceries. I solved my own problems. I never depended on anyone for anything. I was born in a small town in rural Tennessee, where everybody knows everybody's name and everybody's story. My father worked at the paper mill. My mother took in alterations. I grew up learning that life is built on struggle and honest labor, that nobody was going to hand me a single thing for free. I started working young and never complained. On the contrary, I took pride in every blister on my hands. Work gave me dignity, gave me respect, things that meant more to me than money ever could. For decades, that's how it was, living off my own effort and my word. I built my life plank by plank, day after day, and I raised my son, Owen, with that same code. I always thought he understood. I always believed he had learned. But time passed, and I discovered that setting an example isn't enough. Sometimes people choose to forget. The accident that changed everything happened on a regular Thursday morning. I was heading out to run a quick errand, nothing major. A delivery van ran a stop sign, and I didn't have time to brake. The impact threw me forward, and the rest is that blur of pain, sirens, and urgent voices that only those who've lived it can understand. I woke up in the hospital with my wife, Margaret, holding my hand, and the doctor telling me I'd have to learn to live differently. It wasn't easy to hear, wasn't easy to accept, but worse than the wheelchair was what came after, the change in how people looked at me. Suddenly, I wasn't Calvin who fixed everything anymore. I was poor thing to some, the problem to others. Owen was helpful at first, but I soon noticed his patience wearing thin, visits growing shorter, conversations reduced to clipped questions, until that day when he decided to spit the raw truth in my face. I could have fought back, could have yelled, could have listed every midnight I woke to care for him as a baby. Every time I skipped buying something for myself to pay for his college tuition, textbooks, spring break trips. But I didn't. I just breathed deeply and let silence speak for me. Before I continue, I want to thank you for listening here on Revenge with Thomas. This channel has given me the chance to tell this story my way, uncut, unhurried, as if I were talking to an old friend. If this story has already moved you, please subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling us what state you're watching from. It might seem small, but for those of us on this side, it's a way to know we're not talking to ourselves. After he said that, Owen turned his back and left, slamming the door as if he'd won some argument that only existed in his head. I stayed there alone in the living room, listening to the echo of the front gate closing, my eyes fixed on the window, on the quiet street, on the trees swaying in the wind. And it was in that silence that something began to grow inside me. It wasn't pure anger. It was something colder, more calculated, a strange calm, like someone who already knows life is about to change course. I didn't think about revenge in that moment, but I thought about justice. I thought about dignity. I thought that if he had the courage to look at me that way, it was because he had no idea what was still to come. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, his words came back, cutting like a knife. I relived not just that moment, but our entire history. The day I bought his first bicycle, the pride in his eyes when he aced the ACT, the time he cried over a breakup, and I spent hours listening, even without having anything to say. How does someone erase all that? How do memory and gratitude disappear so easily? I had no answer. But I knew I wouldn't wait for him to give me one. The next dawn was different. I woke early, before the sun rose, and lay staring at the ceiling, thinking I'd always been a man of action, of solving things. The wheelchair hadn't taken that away from me. Maybe it had even given me more time to think before acting. And now, more than ever, I knew I needed to think carefully, because whatever action I took wouldn't just be to prove something to him. It would be to remind myself who I was. I looked out the window and saw the street still empty, the silence broken only by a rooster's crow in the distance. I smelled coffee coming from the kitchen, and for a moment almost allowed myself to forget everything. But his words were engraved there, and with them the certainty that I wouldn't let this slide. Not this time. Maybe he thought I'd already given up fighting. Maybe he thought I was resigned. Little did he know that behind my silence, a decision was taking shape. A decision that, when it came to light, would change everything for him and for me. And you who are listening to me now, tell me, have you ever been through a moment when silence was stronger than any response? Comment your experience. Someone might need to hear your story too. I won't lie. After that day, the silence inside my house became heavier. Margaret tried to hide it. She said Owen was stressed about work, that sometimes he speaks without thinking. But I knew my son well enough to know those words weren't a slip. They were thought out. They were felt. And more than that, they were said to hurt me. I can't say what hurt me more. His words, or the fact that I was certain that if I disappeared the next day, he'd go on with his life as if nothing had happened. I'd always been a man of presence. When Owen was born, I didn't have much, but what little I had, I shared with him. I was there on his first day of school, at the high school baseball games, at graduation. I was never one to give expensive gifts, but I was present. Presence, at least in my time, was worth more than anything money could buy. We grew up together in a way. He learned to ride a bicycle while I learned to be a father. And back then, I thought we were building something that time could never destroy. But life has these small cracks that we don't notice until it's too late. First, it was when he went to college and moved to Atlanta. Margaret and I helped with rent, food, even gas money. He'd visit every 3 or 4 months, always in a hurry, always with his phone in hand. Then he got his first job, and gradually the phone calls got shorter. There was no more. Dad, I need your help. Or Mom, make that dish I like. Conversations were reduced to logistics. When he got married, the distance became even greater. Not just physical, but of the soul. The accident just added extra weight to that distance. At first, he'd show up with grocery bags, ask if I needed anything. But it was all automatic. I could tell he was there in body, but with his mind elsewhere. It didn't take long for visits to become more spaced out, and his patience shorter and shorter, until it reached the point where, in a moment of coldness, he looked me in the eyes and called me useless. I could have told Margaret everything I felt in that moment, but I preferred to keep it to myself. I didn't want her to be hurt. 2. She'd always been the balance of our family, the one who saw the best in people, even when there wasn't much to see. And I needed to think calmly before acting, because inside me the hurt wasn't just from what he said, it was from what he forgot. One rainy afternoon, while I was looking out the window, I saw a boy crossing the street with difficulty, carrying a bag bigger than himself. That brought me such a vivid memory. It seemed like it was happening right in front of me. Owen and I coming back from the grocery store when he was about 11 years old. The bag was heavy, and he insisted on helping. Halfway home, he tripped, fell, tore the bag, and scattered everything on the ground. I didn't complain. I picked him up and carried the groceries with my other hand. That day, he said to me with tears in his eyes, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." Oh, I believed he meant he wanted to be honest, hardworking, someone people could be proud of. But today, I don't know if he even remembers that afternoon. The nights became long for me. I couldn't sleep well. I kept remembering every sacrifice I made for him, not as a demand for gratitude, but as if I were trying to convince myself that our relationship had been real, that it wasn't just my illusion. It's strange. We raise a child thinking we're planting deep roots, but sometimes we discover they were just thin branches that the first strong wind blew away. It was in this state of reflection that I began to notice his attitudes more. One thing here, another there, small demonstrations of impatience, of indifference. I also began to notice that when he came here, it wasn't just a visit. He always had some hidden motive, a conversation that ended up revolving around himself. I don't know if it was coincidence or if it was already his intention, but that began to bother me. I, who had always avoided unnecessary confrontations, this time couldn't simply pretend I didn't see. One day, Margaret mentioned that Owen was having problems at work. She said he was worried about layoffs at the company, about rumors of changes. I listened in silence. I didn't say anything. But inside, something stirred. I knew the company where he worked very well, more than he could imagine. And suddenly I realized that fate was putting me at a crossroads. It wasn't time to act yet, but I knew the time was approaching. The following week, he showed up here again. Margaret was happy, made coffee, cut pound cake. I stayed in my wheelchair just watching. He talked and talked, but didn't ask anything about me. It was as if I were an extra in my own house, until in the middle of the conversation, he dropped another cutting remark. "You should get used to it. Dad, the world is like that. Those who don't produce get left behind." I didn't respond, but my silence was no longer one of pain. It was from someone who already had an ace up his sleeve. And in that moment, while he drank his mother's coffee and talked about himself, I decided I wouldn't be forgotten. Not like this. I've never believed in coincidences. I've always thought things happen at the right time, even if we don't understand immediately. After Margaret mentioned that Owen was worried about layoffs at the company, I started paying more attention to what he said on the few occasions he came here. It was curious. He didn't talk much about work, but when he did, he seemed not to notice that some of his words brought back old memories. He'd mention changes in the sector, talk about names of people I knew well, describe meetings in rooms I'd been in so many times I could draw them with my eyes closed. It was like hearing someone talk about a house you helped build, but that now he thinks belongs only to him. On one of those visits, Owen let slip a detail that made me smile inside. He mentioned that the company owner never appeared, that he was a distant man concerned only with numbers and contracts. I held back laughter. It wasn't the moment to correct the image he had. On the contrary, the more he thought like that, the more calmly I could act when the time came. My involvement with that company began long before Owen even knew what he wanted to do with his life. I was already financially stable, but I wasn't a man to sit idle. When the opportunity arose to invest in that business, I saw not only a good financial return, but also the chance to create something solid that could cross generations. I made sure to keep my participation secret for strategic and personal reasons. I never liked to show off and preferred that my name stay out of the spotlight. While he talked about rumors of layoffs, I just thought, my son has no idea that in the end he answers to me. It was a strange feeling. At the same time, it hurt to see him treat me with contempt. There was also a hint of irony in the fact that he depended, without knowing, on decisions I would one day make. But don't be mistaken. I wasn't planning to humiliate my son in public. It wasn't about cheap revenge. It was about dignity. It was about showing that life comes full circle and that respect isn't optional. One afternoon, after one of his quick visits, I went to my office, a small room at the back of the house where I keep documents, old photos, and memories of a lifetime of work. I opened a drawer and took out a Navy folder. There were some old contracts, meeting minutes, proof of corporate participation, papers that to anyone else might seem like bureaucracy, but to me were a concrete piece of my history. I ran my hand over them and felt the weight of the years. While leafing through, I also found an old photo, me, younger, wearing a suit and tie next to the other company founders. I remembered the day we took that photo. We were exhausted, but happy. There was no luxury, just the satisfaction of seeing something we built from scratch beginning to bear fruit. I put the photo back and closed the drawer. It still wasn't time to show anything. Margaret noticed I was quieter than usual and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said yes, that I was just thinking about life. She didn't insist. My wife always knew that when I say I'm thinking, it's because something is forming in my head. Days passed, and Owen came back to visit. This time he seemed more agitated. He said the company was going through an internal audit, and that was making everyone nervous. I just listened, asking neutral questions. He told me some senior employees were being called in to talk, and that there were rumors of even deeper cuts. With each word, I saw the noose tightening, not around his neck, but around my plan. And it was that day that something curious happened. Owen, without realizing it, asked me for advice. He said he was thinking about how to stand out so he wouldn't be laid off. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he kept his gaze fixed on mine. Work as if the owner is watching you every day. Son, because sometimes he is. He gave a quick smile, somewhat mocking, and replied, "Ah, Dad, the owner there doesn't even know who I am." I just nodded with a smile he didn't understand. After he left, I spent some time on the porch, watching the street. The wind was blowing gently, and the sky was beginning to change color with evening. I knew I was getting close to the time to act, but I also knew that to have the impact I wanted, everything needed to be at the right moment. Margaret, who had always been more conciliatory, began to notice my different posture. One night, while we were having coffee, she asked me, "Calvin, are you going to do something about Owen? Aren't you?" I didn't lie. I said simply, "I am, but not now. It's not the moment yet." And inside me, I knew when the time came, he would understand not only who I was, but also what it means to underestimate someone who had always been by his side. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear how this all unfolds, make sure to subscribe to Revenge with Thomas and hit that notification bell. And tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the quietest moments. Life has a curious way of bringing together pieces we thought were scattered too far apart to ever meet. On a gray Tuesday, one of those days when the wind rattles the windows and even the clock seems to move slower, my office phone rang. I was alone. Margaret had gone to the grocery store. I looked at the caller ID and recognized the number before it rang a third time. It had been a long time, a very long time. I answered without rush, with that calm I'd learned to cultivate after the accident. On the other side, the same voice that had accompanied me for decades. Mr. Calvin, it's Harold. The name settled in me like a good but heavy memory. Harold had started as a stock clerk, worked his way through the ranks, pulling all-nighters, doing inventory. He became operations manager when nobody wanted to take on that headache, and eventually became one of those pillars that hold up a building, even when the facade starts to crack. I need to talk to you about work, he said, putting emphasis on the last word, like someone who knows that for me. Work was never just a job. It was always the language of dignity. I asked him to come to the house in the late afternoon. When Margaret returned, she noticed I had a different posture. Having company, I nodded. Yes, from the old days. She prepared fresh coffee, saved a piece of apple pie, and set the table with the simple elegance I'd always admired in her. Before the clock struck 5, Harold parked his car at the door. He got out with the steps of someone who still carries the weight of warehouse floors in his body, but brought in his eyes the same loyalty that made me trust him for years. He came in, hugged me without exaggeration, and sat down. He didn't even touch the coffee. He opened his briefcase. It's different in there. Mr. Calvin, he began, running his fingers over some papers, like someone smoothing a horse's mane before mounting it. There's an audit running through the hallways, spreadsheets jumping off screens, people afraid to look each other in the eye, and a noise that's not from machines. It's from people. He paused briefly and carefully added, Your Owen is in the middle of that noise. I stared out the window for a second, not to escape the conversation, but to remember to breathe the long way. What kind of noise, Harold? He breathed deeply. The kind that doesn't forgive, the kind we can't erase from nothing, he reported, without the flavor of gossip, with the precision of someone who always respected facts. He said that in a team meeting. Owen had gotten heated with a younger analyst, questioned her competence out loud, and when a supervisor tried to calm things down, he said that whoever slows down the machine needs to be replaced. The next day, he was harsh with the warehouse staff over a late delivery without first asking why it was late. There was also an unfortunate comment about an employee who returned from medical leave. Harold's exact words hung in the air like dust. He said, "The company isn't a rehabilitation clinic." I gripped the armrest of my wheelchair, not from anger, but to keep my voice from trembling. It was as if the phrase that hurt me at home had sprouted with different clothes inside the company. Margaret, who had been listening silently from the kitchen, approached slowly and placed a cup in front of us. Harold thanked her with a nod and continued. "There's more," he said, and took a manila envelope from his briefcase. Inside were meeting minutes, audit reports, some printed emails, nothing that broke ethics. Everything within what an experienced manager knows he can and should document. He showed me an underlined section. The audit pointed out foolish waste in sectors I knew like the back of my hand. These were signs of carelessness, not malice, but carelessness in a chain becomes culture, and culture becomes destiny. As I read through each line, memories lit up. The midnight when we decided to change packaging suppliers. The training I personally invested in to reduce damage. The time we established that nobody would go on vacation without properly passing the baton. All of this now seemed folded and stuffed in some random drawer. "Why did you bring this to me, Harold?" I asked. Not as someone who doubts, but as someone asking to hear the truth said loud and clear. He didn't stutter. "Because you taught me that responsibility doesn't retire, and because there are people there who still work, looking over their shoulders, waiting for you to walk through that door." I smiled slightly. Not from vanity at being expected. I smiled because I recognized the invisible line that sometimes connects a man to what he built. It doesn't break easily. The conversation continued until evening. We talked about people, not just numbers. He mentioned names I kept like family. Mrs. Elaine, the secretary who corrected minutes with a red pen. Tom from the warehouse who said good morning twice. Once for whoever heard it, and once for himself. Laura from quality control, who had the gift of finding problems before problems were born. "Those ones still hold the line," Harold said. "But they're tired." I thought about how the exhaustion of good people usually comes silently through accumulated honesty, and how the arrogance of those who arrive without knowing the history speaks too loudly because it's afraid of its own emptiness. When Harold left that night, I stayed on the porch, breathing the smell of rain. The manila envelope was in my lap. Heavy as a decision. Margaret sat beside me. "You trusted him your whole life," she said, "and I trust him today." I nodded, still looking at the sky. "Calvin, what are you going to do?" I didn't make any promises. I learned that promises without time and without a path become excuses. But I shared with her the thought that made me sleep peacefully that night. I'm going to remember who I am, and I'm going to remind my son what the word respect means. The next day before sunrise, I organized my office like someone preparing an altar. I dusted picture frames, aligned pens, left Harold's folder on the left and on the right. A small cedar box I'd kept since I was young. In it, things that time doesn't devour: old letters, my father's pocket watch, a plastic ID badge with my faded photo. I picked up the badge. I remembered the day I received it, still in the old building, when the elevator was always breaking, and we'd climb stairs with our shoes in our hands so as not to make noise. On the back, written in pen, a note from me to myself: "Whoever enters through this door must come back better than they entered." I spent time staring at those crooked letters. It was a type of prayer, and I needed one. Later, I received another call. This time, a young, trembling voice that called me Mr. Calvin, like someone calling for help. It was Heather, a logistics analyst, daughter of Jack, who once stayed up all night with me doing inventory when the system crashed. "Mr. Calvin, sorry to bother you. I don't know who to talk to. The atmosphere here is bad. Couldn't you? I don't know. Stop by here one day." I closed my eyes and heard what was behind the question. It wasn't just about the company. It was about belonging, about feeling that behind the walls, there's someone who remembers the doorman's name and knows that behind each employee number, there's a story. I thanked her, said she did the right thing calling, and that for now I needed her to do one simple thing: continue doing her job the right way, even when nobody was watching. She breathed relieved on the other side, like someone who got a map on notebook paper. When I hung up, I stared at the phone for a few seconds. Sometimes requests come small, but carry the urgency of the future with them. That night, Owen showed up without warning. He came in with his usual rush, smell of strong cologne, phone in hand. talking to someone via voice message about deadlines, goals, people who delay. Margaret tried to bridge the distance with a plate of hot food. He ate standing up, looking at notifications, and without realizing it, left a blue folder on the table. I saw the confidential stamp. Audit. I didn't touch it. He noticed my attention, and perhaps from sudden guilt, pushed the folder into his backpack. Then he turned to me and made a comment intended to be clever. Dad, if you knew the owner there, you'd tell him to show up more. Some employees only work when pushed. I looked at him without hurry. Really, and who told you the owner doesn't show up? He gave a short laugh. Dad, don't go there. That guy doesn't even know I exist. When he left, the house became too big again. I went to my office, opened Harold's folder, looked through the last pages, and then picked up the cedar box. Inside, besides the badge, there was a white envelope with my name written by hand in small letters. I didn't remember it being there. I opened it carefully. It was an old letter from the eldest founder, written the day we signed the first big contract. One line went through me like it was new. If you ever notice that the house we built is losing the smell of people, come back through the front door. The house is still yours. I closed the letter slowly. The night was silent, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to search for the answer at the bottom of any well. I knew where to start. Tomorrow morning, before any meeting, someone was going to receive a visit they didn't expect. And I, who had learned to speak loudly with silence, was ready to open the right door. I woke before dawn, not because I had arranged anything, but because I knew the day was going to be different. The body understands when it's about to cross a door that doesn't open every day. Margaret was still sleeping, her serene face turned toward the window. I showered longer than usual. I chose a light gray shirt I'd been saving for special occasions and ran a comb through my hair with the calm of someone who had used that gesture as a shield in difficult meetings. I put on my old watch, a silver anniversary gift, and spent a few seconds looking at my own reflection. It wasn't vanity, it was recognition. I needed to remind myself that despite the wheelchair, I still knew how to arrive somewhere with dignity. I didn't call anyone. I took a taxi. The driver, a young man, started conversation, asked if I knew the address. I smiled. I used to work around there. He had no idea of the weight that phrase carried. The route was familiar. The streets, the intersections, even the smell of donuts coming from a bakery on the corner before the building. When we arrived, I looked up and saw the facade, the modern sign, the automatic doors, everything different. But behind the glass, you could still see the hallway where years ago I used to greet everyone one by one before going upstairs. I went in. The security guard at reception, a guy who couldn't be more than 30, looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" I responded, with a good morning that was more of a test than a greeting. He returned it formally, but with a touch of friendliness. I asked for Harold. He seemed puzzled but called the extension. While I waited, I noticed the movement. People walking fast, few smiles, looks more focused on screens than on the faces beside them. It wasn't how I remembered it. In the old days, the company floor had the sound of machines mixed with conversation, jokes, nicknames. Now the silence was cut by hurried steps and the beep of ID cards at the turnstiles. Harold appeared a few minutes later, same as always. Firm hands, straight posture, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. When he saw me, his look changed, a mix of respect and concern. He shook my hand firmly. "Let's go up," he said. In the elevator, he gave me a quick overview. It wasn't just rumors. There were planned cuts, structural changes, and in the middle of it all, an atmosphere of distrust. People look sideways before saying anything, he commented. I knew this was a sign that the company culture was sick. We got off on the fourth floor. The conference room was occupied. Through the glass door, I saw tense faces and spreadsheets projected on the wall. We continued down the hallway, and there I found something that hit me hard. A row of old photos of the founders. Mine was there, a bit faded, without prominence. I didn't care about the place on the wall. What bothered me was seeing that nobody stopped to look. They passed by as if it were just any picture without history. The world is quick to forget who opened the doors. Harold took me to this break room. A small group was having coffee, talking quietly. I recognized two of them, Tom from the warehouse and Laura from quality control. When they saw me, they took a second to believe it. Mr. Calvin in the flesh. Their eyes shone, not with formality, but with memory. Tom gave me a tight hug, the kind that doesn't fit in conduct manuals. Laura, emotional, said she thought she'd never see me again. I didn't ask questions there, just listened. And what I heard confirmed everything. Hasty cuts. Decisions coming from above without consulting those who understand the ground level. Good people asking to quit before being pushed out. I stayed briefly. I didn't want my presence to become talk before the right time. As I left, I passed the photo hallway again. I lightly touched the frame of mine. It wasn't nostalgia. It was commitment. In the taxi back, I thought about what I'd seen. What was happening inside wasn't just bad management. It was disrespect for history, for the people who held that company together in the worst years. And in the middle of it all, my son, occupying a comfortable chair, repeating the same cold phrases he'd thrown at me at home. He might not know it, but the line connecting his destiny to mine was about to get much shorter. That night, Margaret noticed I was different. Did you see what you needed to see? I did, and now I know what to do. Man, she didn't ask anything more. She knows the weight of my silence. I had returned through the front door, and the next time I entered, it wouldn't be just a visit. In the following days, each morning started earlier, not from anxiety, but from strategy. What I'd seen at the company wouldn't leave my mind. It wasn't just about my son. It was about every employee holding that machine together with their own hands. About history being treated as if it were disposable. And it was also about me. About accepting being put in the corner like a broken piece. I began working silently here at home in my office. I pulled out old folders, contracts, minutes, and meeting records I'd kept carefully. Each document was a memory, and each memory a piece of the map I was drawing. It wasn't revenge. It was settling accounts. I knew the best way to act was without haste, but with precision. Harold came to visit me twice that week. He brought fresh news. Mr. Calvin, the buzz has increased. Some people already have their boxes ready to take their things home. He handed me a paper with a list of names. I recognized many. They were people who'd been with me from the beginning. People I'd watched grow, marry, have children, and who were now in the crosshairs of cold decisions. I breathed deeply. These ones aren't leaving like this. Harold looked at me like someone waiting for explanation. But I didn't give one. It still wasn't time to talk. I called a contact I hadn't used in years. Mr. Thompson, my trusted lawyer. He answered with his always firm voice. Calvin, it's been so long. Long enough for us to have a lot to catch up on. I scheduled a meeting at his office. I took with me the Navy folder with all the documents proving my position in the company. I put the folder on his desk, and he leafed through it carefully. You have control. Calvin, you just need to decide when and how you're going to exercise it. I nodded. The when is soon. The how I'm fine-tuning. Meanwhile, I maintained discreet contact with Laura and Tom. I called them in the late afternoon asking how things were going there. Laura said the pressure had increased, and many people were demotivated. Tom told me he saw Owen arguing with a colleague in front of everyone, using words you don't use, even with strangers. Each report was another brick in the wall I was building. Margaret noticed my routine had changed. You're spending more time in the office. You're preparing yourself, aren't you? I smiled. I'm organizing the house. Margaret. And not just ours. She nodded with that look of someone who understands more than they say. On Friday, I received an unexpected call. It was Heather, the logistics analyst who had called me before. Her voice was shaking. Mr. Calvin, sorry to call again, but today something happened. Owen made me redo an entire report just because I questioned a number that didn't add up. He said that if I couldn't handle it, maybe I should look for another place to work. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of each word. I thanked her for telling me and asked her not to mention to anyone that she talked to me. That night, I went to the back of the closet and took out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside, besides old papers, there was a brass key. It was the key to my office from when I regularly went to the company. I ran my finger over it and felt that time hadn't taken away its weight. That key didn't just open a physical door. It opened a part of my life I was about to reclaim. On Sunday, I sat with Margaret on the porch. The sun was setting slowly, painting the sky orange. Margaret, when I go back in there, it won't be as a visitor. She said nothing, just held my hand. And it was in that silence that I realized the time was coming. I was ready to remind everyone, and especially my son, that no matter how much they tried to rewrite history, whoever built the foundation always knows how to sustain it or tear it down. Monday began with an overcast sky and heavy air, as if even the weather was warning that something important was about to happen. I had coffee early, mentally reviewed each step of what I would do, and put in my folder all the documents confirming my position as majority partner. The brass key was in my suit jacket pocket. Margaret looked at me at the door and said simply, "Take it easy, Calvin, but go." I got a rideshare and asked the driver to stop a block before the company. I wanted to arrive walking, feeling the ground, observing the movement from afar. The building was the same as I'd left it on my last visit, but I was no longer the same man who had entered through reception that other time. At reception, the security guard, the same polite young man, recognized me and opened a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Calvin. Do you have a scheduled meeting?" I replied that I did, and showed the old ID badge I still kept. He looked, noticed the name, and made a gesture of respect that assured me I wasn't forgotten by everyone. In the elevator, I met Laura. She looked at me surprised, but disguised it. "Good morning, Mr. Calvin." "Good morning, Laura. Today, I came to resolve some pending issues." She didn't ask anything more, but her look said she knew something was in the air. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, I walked straight to my old office. The brass key turned in the lock, as if it had been used yesterday. The smell was the same, a mixture of paper, coffee, and a light touch of aged wood. I closed the door behind me and breathed deeply. I turned on the computer that was still there. Yes, it was still mine, and I began accessing files that by contract were under my authorization. I revisited reports, minutes from recent meetings, and especially decisions approved without my signature. There was more than carelessness. There was a pattern. Harold came in a few minutes later bringing 2 folders. Here are the documents we agreed on. And Calvin. Owen arrived early today. He's in the conference room. Board meeting. My heart beat faster, but not from anxiety. It was from the certainty that the moment to cross paths was near. I spent the morning reviewing data and noting critical points. It wasn't just about acting as owner. It was about acting as someone who knows every brick of that place. Between one paper and another, the door opened again. Tom came in somewhat awkwardly and placed a coffee cup on my desk. To kill the nostalgia, boss. I smiled. It was more than coffee. It was loyalty. Just before lunch, I decided to walk through the sectors. Conversations diminished when I passed. But the looks said everything. Respect, curiosity, hope. In the logistics sector, I saw Heather working concentrated. She looked up, saw me, and gave a shy smile. I didn't need to say anything. Her gesture was enough to confirm I was on the right path. On the way back to my office, I passed by the glass door of the boardroom. There was Owen, gesticulating, talking loudly, surrounded by supervisors. He hadn't seen me yet. I preferred it that way. The revelation needed to be at the right moment with everyone present, so it would be clear to each person there who I was and what I represented. Back at my desk, I closed the folder, looked at the brass key, and felt the calm of someone who controls their own time. I had officially entered back in, and now each step brought me closer to the moment when my son would understand that the man he called useless was in fact the one who decided his future in there. And that time was closer than he imagined. The next morning, I woke with the same feeling of someone who knows they're going to cross a line from which there's no return. Margaret prepared my coffee, but before I could take the first sip, she placed her hand over mine and said, "Today's the day, isn't it?" I just nodded. I didn't need to explain. She knew I'd been building this moment piece by piece, like someone assembling a puzzle without letting any piece be missing. I arrived at the company earlier than everyone. Reception already knew me, and there wasn't even the formality of asking for documents. I went up to my office, the one I'd reclaimed without fanfare, and turned on the computer. The first email I sent was short, but loaded with meaning. Board meeting, main conference room, 2 p.m., mandatory attendance. I put my name at the end, without titles, without positions, just Calvin. The effect was immediate. Before 9 a.m., Harold came in laughing quietly. There are already people downstairs asking what this means. They're saying it's orders from the board, that it came from above. I smiled. It did come from above. Yes. He understood and didn't ask anything more. I spent the morning organizing the documents I would take with me. They weren't just formal papers. They were living proof that I'd always been present, even from afar. Old photos from inaugurations, newspaper clippings, contracts with my signature, things that to some might seem like memories, but that day would become arguments. At 1:50 p.m., I left my office and walked down the hallway toward the conference room. The buzz was already audible before opening the door. When I entered, silence fell like a curtain. Everyone looked at me, some with surprise, others with a respect you can see even in the way they straightened their posture. Owen was there at the end of the table with an expression mixing confusion and impatience. "Dad, what are you doing here?" His voice echoed in the space. Trying to sound firm, but failing in the last tone, I placed my folder on the table calmly. Today I came to work. Owen. I looked around and saw faces that had accompanied me for years and others I didn't know. I began to speak, not as someone asking permission, but as someone reclaiming the place that had never stopped being theirs. Some of you know me. Others have only heard about me. My name is Calvin, and this company isn't just where you work. It's part of my life. I was here before the walls had paint, before the machines started turning. I invested, built, and followed every step so we could get to where we are. Owen shifted in his chair. Dad, I don't think this is the time. I raised my hand, cutting off the sentence. On the contrary, it's exactly the time because I heard, saw, and felt things that showed me the essence of this house is being lost. And I won't allow it. I opened the folder and began showing one by one the documents proving my position as majority partner. There was no way to contest it. Each paper had my registered and validated signature. I never needed to appear to prove who I am, but it seems the time has come to remind everyone. The silence in the room was so dense you could hear people breathing. Owen was motionless, his gaze fixed on the papers. I knew he was putting the pieces together, realizing that the man he called useless was in fact the one with the power to decide if he stayed there. I closed the folder with a sharp click. Today I won't make any hasty decisions, but I want everyone here to know that from now on I'll be present. And the first change starts with respect. From today on, nobody here will be treated as disposable. I left the room slowly, leaving behind a loaded silence. I didn't need to see Owen's face at that moment to know that his ground had just shifted. Hey, if you're finding this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe to Revenge with Thomas and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from. It means everything to know this message is reaching people who need to hear it. The day after the meeting, I arrived early at the company. The atmosphere in the hallways was different. There was no more that nervous rush, but a curious silence, as if everyone was paying attention to what I would do next. People greeted me more firmly, some even with a slight smile. It was the kind of respect that isn't imposed by shouting, but by presence. Owen didn't show up in the morning. Harold told me he'd asked to work from home, resolving pending issues. I knew what that meant. He needed time to digest the scene from the day before and decide how to react. But fate has a habit of accelerating certain responses. Around 11:30, he entered my office without knocking. I closed the folder I was analyzing and looked at him. His face was different. There wasn't the usual arrogance, but it also wasn't a genuine apology. It was something in between, a mixture of regret and fear. Dad, I didn't know. Why didn't you ever tell me? I crossed my hands on the desk. Because I wanted you to be a man without needing to know that. I wanted to see how far you'd go on your own. And now I know. He looked down, fidgeting with his pockets. I said things I shouldn't have. I was under pressure. I breathed deeply. Pressure doesn't create character. Owen, it reveals it. I let the phrase hang in the air. Yesterday, I said I wouldn't make any hasty decisions. And I won't. But from now on, my work here is to give this company back what it lost. And if you want to continue being part of this, you'll have to change the way you treat people. He nodded. But I could tell it was more from convenience than conviction. And that gave me the certainty that I would need to go beyond words. In the afternoon, I gathered some of the company's old leaders, people who knew the DNA of that place. Laura, Tom, and Harold were there along with two other supervisors I respected. I presented a reorganization plan, putting the more experienced employees to train new teams and creating a monitoring system to avoid repeated errors. They understood that this wasn't just about management. It was about recovering dignity. At the end of the day, I asked Heather to come to my office. I handed her a document confirming her promotion to logistics coordinator. She was speechless. But Mr. Calvin, you just did your job with honesty, even when it cost you problems. That's what I want here. When she left, I stayed alone, looking out the window. I knew Owen would see this decision as a message. And it was, not to humiliate him, but to show that respect is earned by example. That night at home, Margaret asked me if I felt like I was winning. I thought for a few seconds before answering. It's not about winning, Margaret. It's about making it clear that nobody erases the history of those who built it. And deep down, I knew there was still one last piece missing. The one that would make my son understand once and for all that certain bridges can't be crossed without learning to respect those who built them. I arrived that morning with my mind made up. There was no more room for half measures. I'd given Owen time to absorb, to reflect, to show he could change. But what I saw in the week that passed was just strategic silence, not true repentance. And in a company like in life, silence without action doesn't sustain the structure. Before the workday began, I called Harold to my office. I handed him a folder with signed documents. He opened it, read, and looked at me seriously. Are you sure? Calvin, I am. And if I don't do this now, everything we built will lose value. He nodded. Then let's do it right. At 10 a.m., I asked to convene everyone from the board to the conference room. I entered last with slow steps, feeling the weight of the wheelchair, but with my head held high. Owen was there, restless, fingers drumming on the table. The others waited silently. I placed the folder in front of me and began to speak. When I returned to this company, it wasn't to take up space. It was to recover what it always had that was most important. Respect. Respect for people, for work, and for history. I looked at Owen without hurry. I gave you, my son, every opportunity to learn this by example. But I realized that sometimes the lesson only sinks in when life changes position. I opened the folder and took out the main document. Starting today, Owen, you'll be transferred to an operational area in the logistics sector. You'll work directly with the team under Heather's coordination. His eyes widened. Dad, this is a demotion. No, son, it's learning. If you want to command someday, you first need to understand what it means to serve. The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Some in the room hid slight smiles like those who know justice was done without humiliation. Owen, visibly embarrassed, didn't say anything more. He signed the form, closed his folder, and left. I knew he needed this shock, and I also knew that deep down he still had time to reflect on what had happened. When the meeting ended, I stayed alone in the room for a few minutes. I looked at the old photo of the founders on the wall and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. I had done what needed to be done. Not to get revenge, but to preserve what matters. When I got home, Margaret was waiting for me on the porch. Is it over? It's over. At least this part. She smiled. And are you at peace? I am. Because in the end, Margaret, life is like this. Those who build have the duty to protect, And sometimes protecting means putting things in their place, even if it hurts. I looked at the sky, which was already beginning to take on the colors of evening, and thought about everything life had taught me. Respect isn't imposed by position or money. Respect is earned by example and maintained by the courage not to give it up, no matter the cost. And you who listened to me until here, have you ever been through a moment when you had to assert yourself so as not to lose your own history? Comment below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, dignity is never negotiable. Never. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Revenge with Thomas. Hit that like button. And tell me in the comments what state you're watching from. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the quietest voices. And every father's wisdom deserves to be heard. Until next time, remember, respect isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes it has to be reclaimed.